Hello, good morning. Thank you very much for coming. It's 10 o'clock, so we'll begin. Today we're going to present the latest annual report from the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance, or ECRI, which of course is not part of the European Commission, but part of the 46-nation Council of Europe. My name is Andrew Cutting. I'm responsible for communication at the Council of Europe office here in Brussels. I'm joined today by Bertil Cottier, who's the chair of ECRI, Tena Šimonović Einwalter, from the ECRI member from Croatia, Els Keytsman, who's part of the ECRI bureau and represents Belgium, and also ECRI's executive secretary, Johan Friestedt, on the far left. We're going to start today with a very short video, just highlighting some of the key points of today's report. Then each of the speakers, three of the speakers, are going to present some of the main findings in specific areas, and then we will open the floor to questions, both for people here in the room and those people who are joining us online. So, without any further ado, perhaps we can start the video. At that point, I will pass the floor to Bertil to introduce the report.
Merci beaucoup, bienvenue, welcome. Be smart, be loud, be tough, make an impact. These are the recommendations made to us ECRI, the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance. Recommendations made by the very first chair of ECRI, Frank Orton, who came to Strasbourg in October last year to mark ECRI's 30 years of existence with us. In these words, I repeat, be smart, be loud, be tough, make an impact. These words resonate even more strongly today after so many changes in our political, social, and economic environment over the last months, not only in Europe, but also on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. More than 30 years ago, in 1994, ECRI became operational to monitor all forms of racism, intolerance, and related discrimination in Europe. I should specify that ECRI was established to look into racism, intolerance, and discrimination of a more general, structural, or institutional nature, and not individual cases. ECRI was therefore meant to be a specialized, preventive, and independent monitoring mechanism that is complementary to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. I have to say that we are now at a crucial point in time for ECRI. On the one hand, there has perhaps never been such a level of awareness about the dangers of racism and intolerance as being direct threats to our European democracies, the rule of law, and human rights. But paradoxically, on the other hand, action against racism and intolerance and the promotion of equality have perhaps never been so challenged. And this is not only a European phenomenon. The arrival of a new administration in the United States in January shed further light on this paradox. In this context, we are deeply saddened by the decision of the United States to withdraw its observer status in ECRI last February as a result of a presidential executive order of January 2025. Now, some of you may remember that last year we focused our attention on the consequences of conflicts in or outside Europe. We warned against an increasingly worrying anti-migrant rhetoric in the political sphere and in the media when it comes to people fleeing war or other emergencies from outside Europe. We pointed to a significant rise in anti-immigrant and at times anti-Muslim public discourse in some member states, portraying newcomers as a threat to national security or national identity. We also warned about the sharp rise of anti-Semitism in Europe and anti-Muslim racism, gaining further ground in relation to, fully or in part, the Israel-Gaza conflict. And regrettably, it turns out that 1 year later, these challenges still need to be addressed. In the meantime, we consider that there is a need for resolute action in 4 other areas: preventing and combating racial profiling by law enforcement officials, addressing school segregation of Roma children, countering transphobia and ensuring equal rights and dignity for transgender and intersex persons, and finally, but last but not least, strengthening equality bodies across Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bertil. I believe Tena was going to go next.
So one of the first trends or issues that we're pointing at in the report of our activities in our annual report for 2024 is racial profiling and the need for action against racial profiling. Now, the need to address the risk of racial profiling practices in law enforcement is certainly not new. This is not the first time that ECRI has raised this issue. Racial profiling and other racist police abuse is something that we, as well as other bodies doing similar work, including in the United Nations, have warned against over the last 3 decades. Especially back in 2020, we as ECRI issued an exceptional public statement on the matter, and that was also the year that the United Nations Committee, the third committee, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, also issued a general recommendation dedicated to the preventing and combating racial profiling by law enforcement officials. So why do we raise this issue as a trend? Why do we flag it in the 2024 annual report? The reason is that the amount of information which is indicative of such practices, and such practices really either emerging or persisting in quite a number of European countries. And law enforcement officials stopping people in the street based on their skin color, based on their real or perceived national or ethnic background, religion, or citizenship is wrong, and it also is in contradiction with European standards. While some look at various ways that the police need to do their work, police tactics, and also may want to justify this. One useful way to look at it is to imagine how it feels to be somebody who is stopped and searched while walking in the street, a part of a group, and being stopped based on their skin color by police officers without having done anything, just walking on the street. Now that feeling and that unjustified practice, which contradicts European standards, is what we are seeing more and more, and something we are also seeing really in relation to various groups of concern to us. So it is migrants, it is people of African descent, it is Roma, it is Muslims who allege being stopped by police officers without objective and reasonable justifications. It is civil society organizations which is bringing the issue forward. It is even some past police officers who are retired or who have left the force who are speaking out about the issue. And we as ECRI definitely think this is an issue which should be really seriously both prevented and combated. At the same time, we also always look for some positives where there are positives, and we are happy to see that there have been initiatives both at the local or national level which aim to prevent such practices, rules being developed, and the key really is monitoring and recording systems which have been set up in some countries. And some countries have gone even further and have drawn lessons from past mistakes. Because when mistakes are made, that's always an opportunity to learn from them. And they are making efforts to address institutional racism within the police.
Thank you very much, Tena. Els is going to introduce two of the other main themes of today's report.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? One of the topics I really want to dive into is the Roma segregation in schools. Yes, working, thank you. In fact, I think it's striking that today we are still talking about school segregation of Roma children. And you know the high concentration of Roma children in certain schools or classes. And in many Council of Europe member states, we are not seeing significant progress. And it is of concern to us that after so many years of action, be it at national level or local level, we continue to see such segregation of Roma children in schools. And it has different forms. It happens often quietly through separate classes in a school or separate buildings, through placement, for instance, in special education without a proper justification, or through residential segregation and therefore problems in the area of housing. And sometimes it's very interlinked. And this segregation is not neutral. It's a violation of the right to quality, the right to inclusive education. It generally leads to low quality education for Roma children, and it continues to be one of the main obstacles for future Roma inclusion. And it's a major drive of structural inequality and social exclusion. And the fact that progress is slow sometimes or often, has generated lots of frustration. Also, there are positive examples. There are countries, for instance, who legally recognize segregation as a serious form of discrimination and invest in real solutions. So ECRI calls on all member states of the Council of Europe to stop treating this segregation as a marginal issue. It is not. And ending all forms of school segregation must become a national priority, for instance, with clear laws, adequate resources, and of course, long-standing commitment. The second important topic for ECRI is intolerance and discrimination against transgender and intersex people. The escalation of transphobic discourse across Europe, it's very broad, it's everywhere. It's no longer just a human rights concern, it is a test of our democracies. Politicians, media outlets, online platforms are fueling hostility, especially when laws are proposed that aim to protect transgender rights. We see that transgender children and youth are particularly targeted in toxic debates about the so-called gender ideology. And trans adults, for instance, face daily exclusion, even violence, or precarious living conditions. And many are pushed into homelessness or informal labor markets. We see mental health struggles, including suicidal ideation. Those are alarmingly prevalent, while access to trans-affirming healthcare remains patchy at best. Also, something important to say about intersex person. Their situation is marked less by hostility, but more by invisibility, but yet the consequences are no less severe. For instance, non-consensual, medically unnecessary surgeries on intersex babies and children continue in the most European countries, violating their right to bodily integrity and self-determination. Or we see often that parents are not given full, accurate information, or that medical records are lost or destroyed. So we urge all governments to prohibit unnecessary medical interventions on intersex children and babies, and to ensure adequate psychological support and guarantee full respect for trans and intersex persons' dignity, identity, and bodily autonomy. Those two topics are tackled often by equality bodies, and that's why the topic that Tena will further elaborate is so important. Thank you, Tena.
Equality bodies are institutions set up at the national level to fight discrimination and to promote equality. And they should be set up in all EU member states. They should be set up in all Council of Europe member states. This is something that ECRI has recommended a long time ago in its General Policy Recommendation number 2, and then relatively recently in its revised General Policy Recommendation number 2. What we have then seen from that is really the EU stepping up the game as well and adopting the Commission recommendation on standards for equality bodies, and recently 2 new directives being adopted. Now, equality bodies, why as ECRI do we focus on them? There are ECRI's natural partners at the national level as national level institutions which must be independent, which must have enough resources, which must have enough powers in order to do the serious and difficult and challenging work of fighting discrimination at the national level. Being really the best placed institutions to do so at the national level. Now, what we have seen as ECRI in our country monitoring work, but also in various other consultations and contacts with equality bodies as our partners in the 2024, was 2 types of challenges or 2 types of issues that equality bodies have been confronted with. One is the growing challenges really going through difficult times given the changing political climate. So political pressures, threats of cutting resources or actually cutting resources, not really being able to fulfill their roles and do their job effectively. And also the other issue is just legally not having enough powers, not having the proper legislation, not having enough resources to start with. So not as a new change, but not really having been set up the way they really should be set up in order to do the job. So what we wanted to flag in the annual report as well was the need to have powerful, independent, and effective equality bodies that member states of the Council of Europe, and then of course also as all EU member states are member states of the Council of Europe as well, to see equality bodies as a strength, not as a critique or as a threat to various people in positions of power, various institutions, which might be discriminating, or various people and forces in society which might be discriminating. So in these times when our democracies, the rule of law and the protection of human rights are being challenged, strong equality bodies is what ECRI will continue recommending.
Thank you very much to all of the panelists. At this point, we'll open the floor to questions. There is a roaming microphone for those people in the room, so if you'd like to ask a question, just please raise your hand. Then it would be great if you could introduce yourself and the organization that you work for. For those people online, I understand it's possible to ask questions either in the chat on the YouTube feed, or alternatively, my contact details are in the invitation you should have received, so please don't hesitate to send me an email or a text message or a WhatsApp. So perhaps we'll start with those in the room. I see there's a question on the back row.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your work, and thank you for coming here to present it to us. It's very appreciated. My name is Emma Kiely, and I'm the EU advisor for a very small organization and a bit of a niche topic, so apologies if we start with this, but it's the International Dalit Solidarity Network. And we work in solidarity with organizations that fight something called caste-based discrimination, which is a discrimination based on social origin. I'll say it maybe for the colleagues in the room, mostly prevalent in Hindu-based communities, and therefore imported with immigration into European countries, notably the UK, where it is estimated to affect around 4.5 million people. And it's from communities coming from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka. And I was very happy to see on your website that on the page of your organization, it does mention that. And of course, it's more of a problem worldwide, but it is imported into communities in Europe. And I find myself difficulties in addressing this topic because it's very unknown. And I think it's maybe a different kind of discrimination than what you address here, because it is actually within a community rather than, I don't want to say from one community to another, but sometimes a marginalized group is discriminated by the rest of society. And this happens within communities. And therefore, I feel is a bit invisible and is not legislated about because it's considered something between a cultural religious practice that is maybe not of our business to deal with. And it would be very much appreciated if you could tell me, if you, obviously not part of your annual report because it's a smaller issue, but if you do work on this issue, if you have raised it in your relations, in your analysis of the UK mostly, and if so, what were your recommendations? Because the UK decided not to legislate specifically on this issue. And so people who are affected by these sort of discriminations don't really know who to turn to because there's no law that they can actually make reference to. Thank you very much. Or if you can refer me to someone that I can...
Maybe Johan, because they're very specific questions. Yes. I think your problem, though you called it unknown or invisible, we have been confronted in certain visits, not you have in the UK, but also in other countries. If I go back to certain visits, we have seen among, for instance, certain minorities, the same kind of minorities within the minorities. We have been confronted. We didn't work specifically on this. We have no specific policy recommendation on that topic, but maybe it's something we should keep in mind and have and maybe in the future look more specifically on. Maybe Johan, you want to add something? Tena?
Sure. What we also tend to encourage as ECRI also is discussions within the community, because sometimes discussions within the community can be well placed and should be supported. But also just to say, the fact that there is no national level legislation does not mean that there's no legislation covering it. So if you look at Article 14 of the European Convention on Human Rights, it has an open list of grounds. So testing whether Article 14 or Protocol 12 of the European Convention, which also has an open list of grounds, covers caste-based discrimination, would certainly be a way to go, and it covers all Council of Europe member states and all EU member states. I'm mentioning that because within EU law we know that the list of grounds is limited. Whether racial or ethnic origin, which is an EU law ground, would cover caste-based discrimination, could also be tested, but personally I would advise to go for the European Convention if a case might show up. But I would certainly not think that this is not covered by legislation, so international law might be the way to go. Also, there might be case law, but I'm not sure, or opinions coming from CERD, because CERD certainly also does cover India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, all the countries where you mentioned this issue might be imported from to European countries.
CERD being the convention.
UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. It is our sister
It's
body
our
in the
counterpart,
UN.
yeah.
And maybe just a few words. We tend in ECRI to, does it work? Yeah. We tend in ECRI to focus on the most marginalized groups in a country, and sometimes it happens that we have to go and to dig into the most marginalized groups within groups. So that happens. It's true that in this the cycle we're just ending of monitoring, we have been very much focusing on Roma and migrants in terms of specific groups in all over Europe, because these groups are the most marginalized in Europe. But I think we are now starting a new cycle where we decided to have a broader view and to look into different group-specific issues also in different countries. So it's something that will probably come up in the future monitoring of ECRI.
And if I may, one last remark or recommendation, because you ask for recommendations. In general, one recommendation we always do is, first of all, to measure things. Data collection is very important, and specifically equality data collection. We see that in many countries there is still some work to do, because if you don't measure something, then it doesn't exist. So equality data collection is very important to have this input for elaborating, for instance, national action plans against racism and discrimination. That's another recommendation that we often do. It's very important to have country-specific action plans that should lead to action, concrete action, country per country. And another topic I wanted to mention was that we are looking into intersectionality. People often have an identity that is very much layered, being part of a community, and for that being discriminated against. But indeed, within communities, we see sometimes those kind of issues. I'm not an expert on the groups you've mentioned, but for instance, Bertil and I visited countries who have Roma population, and there we see some of those issues and problems as well. And it's very important for countries to collaborate with civil society, who knows the communities very well, and to tackle the issue in the best way. But thank you for mentioning this. That alerts us in a good way. Thank you.
We have a question online from the Turkish news agency Anadolu. I was wondering if you could provide us with any numbers with regard to anti-Muslim discourse or anti-Muslim police bias. Has this increased or decreased?
Well, generally speaking, we have seen all across Europe a rise of anti-Muslim hatred. But regarding specific figures, we at ECRI, we don't have figures, covering whole Europe. We cannot say there are so many cases as such.
We do have national data that we request, and the data we got in the recent period show in many cases an increase. sometimes related, and we referred to it already in a previous annual report, that it's also linked to the Israel-Gaza conflict, where you had the rise in anti-Semitism, but also about anti-Muslim racism. But unfortunately for anti-Muslim racism, it's something which is persisting and rising for some time in Europe, and this is really one of our greatest concerns in ECRI, including for the years to come.
If I may, there is of course, there are of course studies and data from other bodies, for instance, and that's not Council of Europe, it's European Union, but the FRA, the Fundamental Rights Agency, dives into that, and there's rather recently they have published a report on being Muslim in the EU, where you indeed can see that in a lot of countries, the perceived discrimination and perceived inequality, which is very real for the persons concerned, that it's on the rise. That's one thing I would like to mention. And since I have the floor, maybe mentioning as well our GPR on anti-Muslim racism. We've put a lot of work on that with a lot of recommendations where countries can make advantage of to tackle anti-Muslim racism and discrimination against Muslims. Thank you.
A GPR being a general policy recommendation to all of the 46 Council of Europe member states. There's a question on the back row.
Yes, good morning. My name is Pietro Guastamacchi. I'm from ANSA, the Italian state news agency. And I was actually wondering if you have specific recommendation for member state. In my case, for example, for Italy, I would be specifically interested in terms of racial discrimination and racial profiling, for example, in law enforcement. But if you encounter any specific phenomena that has been growing towards Italy, or if you have any specific other question regarding specific member states. I think it's not mentioned in the report per member state, right?
So what we do are country reports. So for each country, we have specific recommendations which might be tailored to the specific problem in the country that we visited. Now, of course, regarding Italy, as that you mentioned, we had a specific recommendation regarding racial profiling, and this recommendation was that we recommended to the Italian government to make an independent study on racial profiling to assess the situation, the level of racial profiling in Italy.
Thank you very much. Lucia.
Yeah, it's Lucia Schulten, DW. It's a similar question because you mentioned in the report that the racial profiling is taking place in certain states, but then you don't name them. And I also wonder whether you could maybe say where this is especially prevalent, and also the same for the question of the Roma segregation. Is this the case in all 46 Council of Europe states, or are there some which are a bit more where this is happening more than in others?
Well, we, as ECRI, because we deal with and monitor the situation in all of Council of Europe member states, especially for the annual report, do not name the states as such. But I have to say, for those reports which have been published, the data is out there, and what we said and what we wrote in the individual country reports stands, and it's no secret. However, for some, we cannot really name them right now because the reports, which for those countries, for those visits that have been undertaken, when the reports are not published, then we cannot name the states. So this is always the most interesting question, I would say, at press conferences. So should we name them or should we not? So for those where the reports are out, we are going to name them. Speaking about racial profiling, I can mention France, I can mention Italy. Speaking about the positive efforts, which I mentioned, speaking about racial profiling, I can mention the UK. And now further to you, Els, regarding segregation of Roma children in education.
Yeah. It's true, we do not rank countries. That's not our aim. Our methodology is to have visits, to talk with all actors within the country, and to elaborate a country-specific report with recommendations toward the authorities of that country. But regarding school segregation of Roma children. Yeah, I would like to mention Serbia as an example of segregation of Roma children as an issue, as a problem, even worsening with new laws where now parents really can choose where their children will go to school, and then you see tendencies of not Roma parents sending their children to schools where there's a chance to meet very few Roma children. So that's an example of putting law into place that can even worsen a problem. And yeah, we visit a lot of Roma settlements. I already mentioned in the introduction that there is a link between housing policies or the lack of good housing policies and then the effect on school segregations. But there are also good examples. And a good example of a country really tackling the issue is, for instance, Lithuania. There we see that no longer Roma children are put in separate schools, not even in separate classes in schools. So that proves that a country really can think about the issue and undertake policies, undertake measures to really have good policies, to have equality schools, equality education for all children, because after all, equality and qualitative education is a right for every child.
Maybe an additional comment on regarding our methodology. As Els said, we don't rank countries, but we make recommendations, specific ones, and we also foster dialogue. And for us, the dialogue is very important. That's why we organize in certain countries each year a round table. During those round tables, we have representative of the authorities and representative of civil society. And we tackle one issue or two issues. And we had one round table last year in France, and one of the two topics, the first one was Roma, and the second one was racial profiling, because in France it's some kind of never-ending story, the issue of racial profiling. So we decided, yes, now we take this issue in a round table, and we try to foster dialogue between civil society and authorities on that topic, that difficult topic.
It shows all this that racial profiling, going back to racial profiling in particular, that it's a very sensitive topic that we deal with, because we touch upon police officers. They are in charge of our security, they're protecting us, they also are they help combating racist hate crime as well. So to say that there may be racism within the police is something very sensitive. That's why we had very tense discussions in France last year during a roundtable on that specific topic, on the implementation of one recommendation about setting up a monitoring system about ID controls and stops by the police. That's why it was also a surprise for us in Italy that came up to us, and we had to deal with it, and we asked the authorities to look into the matter through a study. In the UK, it's a different level, because there have been discussions for a number of years, and even the senior police officers are accepted the fact that it may happen, that they have to prevent it, and there have been some action plans. They are looking into institutional racism within the police. So I would say it can pop up anywhere. We even spoke about racial profiling in Iceland not so long ago. So this is really something that can pop up anywhere, and what is a surprise to us maybe is that it comes more often. That's why ECRI also decided to have a specific focus on this in the annual report, because it comes more and more to us as an issue. Does it mean that it's a bigger issue, or does it mean that we are more vigilant? There is more information. It's difficult to say, but clearly it's something that the authorities of all concerned member states should look into in terms of prevention or combating it.
Thank you very much. Chiara, I see you have the microphone.
Yeah, hi, thank you for the presentation. I'm Ciara Carlin from the Brussels Times. You will have seen that 9 European leaders signed a letter last week calling for a reinterpretation of the Convention of Human Rights. And I was just wondering what kind of impact, if any, politicized statements like that have on ECRI's work? And also, is there any correlation between political statements like that and the problems associated with equality institutions that you outline in the report? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. This issue is about independence of the European Human Rights Court is very important. But ECRI is also an independent body, so that's why for us in this political context, which is a bit difficult, where certain countries tend to criticize the work of the court or the work of ECRI, for us it's also key to fight for independence.
I want to for equality bodies, because it's at national level, and you're right to mention it. They are independent, and we, ECRI, are very careful about the independence of equality bodies. Of course, sometimes they are critical of government action, government policies when it touches upon migration and other issues. But that's also why, at national level, we are so much defending the independence and the competencies of the equality bodies all over Europe, because you need, especially in these times, you need very strong equality bodies. Unfortunately, the winds are not really in our favor. They are not really in the favor of equality bodies, but this is probably why all member states should be very careful to have very powerful and independent equality bodies at national level.
Thank you very much. Were there any more questions from the floor? If not, perhaps I have a question. You've mentioned the European Court of Human Rights a couple of times. I was wondering, firstly, if you could expand a bit on the cooperation between ECRI and the court, and then also, given that we're in Brussels, if you could say a few words about relations with the European Union and how that's going, any potential scope for improved cooperation in any areas?
So starting with the European Human Rights Court, we have exchange of views quite frequently with judges of the European Human Rights Court. There was one last year, for instance. We had the chair of the European Human Rights Court coming and addressing the floor during an ECRI plenary session. So we have this kind of exchanges. We do have no exchanges on specific cases, and this is, of course, not possible. What I would also add is the fact that quite often you can see reference to ECRI's work in decisions and judgments of the European Human Rights Court. They specifically make a reference to either our general policy recommendation, number so and so, depending on the case, or on our country visits also, if it's a case involving a specific country, a problem in a specific country. So this is it regarding the European Human Rights Court. Regarding EU, we also have a cooperation with EU. It's not a formal cooperation. In very different specific situations, we cooperate. To take one example, the directive on equality bodies, the two new ones that were adopted in 2024 that Tena mentioned recently, those two texts have been adopted, discussed and debated, and preliminary work, and ECRI participated to this preliminary work. So we have this coordination in order, to give a certain impact to our second policy recommendation, the one on equality bodies that has been revised recently. So there is this kind of exchange with EU bodies as well, depending on topics. Maybe you would add something? Yes.
So our chair mentioned that, of course, the cooperation that you can see also through individual country reports is, and the case law is that the European Court of Human Rights will use not only the GPRs, but also the individual country reports to show a certain practice happening in a certain country, which then forms the basis also for their conclusions within judgments against that country. But also vice versa. When we do our country reports, we will cite the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, which really is a part of the reasoning and our findings, and then also the basis for the recommendations that we give in the country reports. And I'm particularly happy and proud as well that the example you have chosen to really highlight the relationship and the cooperation within the efforts to fight particularly discrimination and racial discrimination and religious discrimination and LGBTIQ discrimination within the EU and within the Council of Europe through various agencies and parts of the EU, and we've mentioned the Fundamental Rights Agency, but also the European Commission within the EU, together with Council of Europe bodies, and here in particular ECRI. One of the great, there are other examples, the various strategies that that are being adopted and have been recently adopted at the EU, but also the story of now legally binding standards for equality bodies at the EU level, which is really a story where you can really see great cooperation, I would say, of ECRI with the European Commission and with the EU, but also with equality bodies. It's a sort of tripartite cooperation, I would say, where really the story started long ago with ECRI's initial recommendations on anti-discrimination legislation and national specialized bodies to combat racism, the way we used to call them back then, but also the year 2000 when the equality law directives were adopted at the EU level. And then within those 15 to 20 years, what we really saw was that there was such difference in how individual countries chose to set up equality bodies. In some countries, they were really large, in some very small, not always in relation to the size or the wealth of the country. In some countries, parts of multi-mandate institutions, in some countries standalone, and in some countries with a lot of powers, and in some countries with very few, in some countries quite independent, and in other countries not so much. And then as ECRI, because one of our pillars is cooperation with civil society and cooperation with equality bodies, we really saw the need to strengthen equality bodies. We saw it from discussing with equality bodies, but also, you know, in the country visits, when we go somewhere to gather information, who do we ask, of course, among other interlocutors? Those who live in the country, work on fighting discrimination, and who can tell us what the situation is. I would not say that, you know, the authorities don't tell us what the situation is, but it is quite clear that what we are told by the authorities is not always totally the same as what we're told by equality bodies, who give us this critical, when independent, critical assessment of the situation. And we saw that there was such difference and we needed standards. And ECRI was really quick to start this conversation, to start the work on revising GPR2, to gather all the equality bodies together. And within that work, when we were drafting that revised general policy recommendation number 2, we also had inputs coming from the EU. And then also later, when this was picked up by the EU, by the Commission first, doing the Commission recommendation on standards for equality bodies, they were also looking at ECRI's general policy recommendation and asking for comments and views and inputs from ECRI. And then finally, the result really is legally binding standards for equality bodies. And mind you, these are actually the only legally binding standards for independent institutions working in human rights. When we're speaking about national human rights institutions, there's Paris principles, they're not legally binding. There's Venice principles of the Council of Europe. We have UN resolutions, we have CM recommendations at the Council of Europe level regarding ombudsman institutions, regarding national human rights institutions, but only regarding equality bodies. We now have legally binding standards at the EU level, which is such a clear example of really great cooperation between, I would say, the EU and the Council of Europe, various parts of the Commission, Fundamental Rights Agency and so on, and ECRI, but also with equality bodies, with those concerned who are fighting discrimination at the national level. And there we can see that the effort really requires the national actor cooperation with European level and international level actors cooperating together. And then finally, what we now await to see is the transposition and then stronger equality bodies. But what is it all for? Fighting discrimination more meaningfully, more effectively. And when you're independent and when you have resources, you can do it well.
Yeah, just to add one point regarding cooperation with the European Union. We also have an observer from the European Union in ECRI. So we have this direct link by way of an observer.
It's your fault, Andrew. You see the passion in terms of cooperating with the European Court of Human Rights and the EU. I just wanted to say one thing from a former president of the European Court of Human Rights when he came to ECRI during a plenary that was many years ago. I think it was President Sicilianos. And he said, and the chair of ECRI said that the court needs ECRI and ECRI needs the court. And I think it's really true. And I think probably we should say that ECRI needs the EU and the EU needs ECRI. And this is something we could see over time and we'll see in future, I'm sure.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone for coming. There are copies of the press release and the report as well, I think. On your way out, please help yourself. And I'd also like to invite you to stay for a quick coffee and a chat with us if you'd like to. There are some snacks on the table behind. Thank you very much also to everyone who followed us online. And we hope to see you maybe next year. Yes. Thank you.